We wrote our report, and it's just a huge bummer for everybody that reads it. And then when I talk about it, everybody's like, "Oh, I didn't need to know all that," but okay. Hello, my name is Aidan Charron. I am the Director of End Plastic Initiatives at EarthDay.org. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Christos Symeonides, an expert in plastics and human health. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks very much. Thanks for bringing me on to discuss my favorite topic.
Excited to have you. So you're a doctor and a scientist, and one of your main areas of research is how plastics and the chemical additives impact human health. Can you talk us through that just a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I might start about how I got into it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
As a doctor, I'm a pediatrician, so look after kids, and I'm really interested in how our changing environment might explain the changing problems that we're seeing from a health perspective in kids in this generation from the generations before. My research is epidemiology, and that's about looking at what's happening in real life and understanding from that where we might be seeing links between changes in our environment to changes in the different diseases and health problems that we're seeing. And as some years ago, before I had quite so much gray hair here and I was thinking what I was going to research, I was looking around and thinking, well, there's a lot changing in our modern life. There's technologies coming through, societal structures are changing. We've got changes in our nutrition. But what really got me interested is our changing chemical environment, because the world we live in, what we breathe, what's in our water, what's in our food, isn't just what grew in the plant or was in an animal running around. It's everything they've eaten or sucked up, and everything that processed it on the way to us. And we live in this chemical environment. And I got interested, well, what's changing in the chemical environment? What should I be looking at if I'm trying to understand the new stuff that we're seeing in children's health? And that took me to plastics. I mean, plastics have revolutionized our world in many ways. And one of it is that they've just completely changed our chemical environment. We have these chemicals that were not there before we had plastics, that now each and every one of us are exposed to, just to different amounts.
Just so everyone else understands watching this, plastic breaks down into tiny fragments called microplastics, and they leach out toxic plastic chemicals. So what did you do?
So I got this deep dive into some of the chemicals in plastics, and then started to realize, there's a bigger picture here. It's not just about the chemical A and chemical B. There's 16,000 other chemicals sitting in the queue, and they're all part of this industry called plastics.
Can you list all the 16,000 chemicals? Have you made it that extensive yet?
So I let myself get diverted. So that's how I got into thinking, hey, I really need to be looking into plastics with my research. And I was lucky just about 4 years ago to link in with an Australian philanthropic foundation, the Minderoo Foundation, which was following some similar thinking at the same time. They were doing a lot of work around plastics as a waste problem. And I think a lot of people know about plastics as a waste problem, especially in the oceans. And they were coming to the realization we need to think about plastics as a health problem too. Because it's indirectly affecting our health through the environment, but is it also directly affecting our health? And that took me to this opportunity to really get in and explore plastics and how they're intersecting with our health in a much broader way. For me, as a researcher, and how chemicals might be affecting our health, plastics is such a special case because it's locking away these chemicals in a way that they would never, many of them would never normally be locked away. Chemicals that wouldn't be persistent and wouldn't be able to travel from one side of the globe to the other in the atmosphere or in the oceans, because they're all locked up in these little fragments of microplastic, because the bolognese is going with the spaghetti, they are lasting for longer in the environment and getting into more places in the environment than they otherwise would. And it's very different. I mean, this is fundamentally different to how that chemical, how we would deal with the safety of that chemical in any other circumstance, because it's all locked in there and it's transported around and then it comes out again in the new place.
It almost makes it sound like it becomes more dangerous almost, or it's just like a little package that we're just shipping off to anywhere essentially. Because I mean, I'm sure you've seen the research of in the middle of the Alps where no one's touched the water in 45 years or 100 years or so, they're finding microplastics, or down at the bottom of the ocean on top of Everest. So it's just, it's wild to think that this wasn't an issue we really thought of until, recently, but we didn't really contribute to the environment until the 1950s, first time Bacillite or whatever you want to call the original plastic came out.
Yeah, I mean, and then it's been exponential growth since then.
Typically, before I really started diving into this kind of work, and before we came up and wrote that report and started really diving into the research, the majority of what we heard was that microplastics as a separate thing from the chemicals. Like, it was microplastics and then you had the additive chemicals. But the more we looked into it, it was like, it's one and the same. What is it truly as bad as we think it is? Is it truly like, what are our concerns? What are your concerns as a doctor, as a pediatrician?
If I were to summarize my concerns in like one sentence, it's I'm concerned by how little we know about the safety, because of the fraction that we do know a lot about is not giving us reassurance about the much bigger world that we don't know enough about. So some of the things, what we really know well about is the chemicals. On the chemicals, and inside the chemicals, it's a few specific chemicals that we know a lot about. I would hope people listening in here might have at least heard before some of these chemical names like BPA, bisphenol A, or phthalates, or PBDs, the brominated flame retardants. We know a lot about this small cluster of chemicals that to me makes me start thinking about the other 16,000 chemicals and how much do we know about them. And if we think about how we have missed, how the processes have failed to identify the potential risks for phthalates, bisphenol A, PBDEs, why should we assume that the replacement coming in would be safer unless something's changed in how you assess it? In the microplastic space, I see this as a huge known unknown, and I find it really interesting because no one was even talking about microplastics 20 years ago.
That was the wildest thing to me. I mean, I went to high school, and we weren't talking about microplastics. Started college, and the research, even then, that was in 2016, seemed still pretty new. Like, I remember us talking about microplastics as like, we're starting to notice that dinoflagellates, like little bitey things, are eating these plastic beads and therefore can't transfer energy up the trophic levels. But that was basically our understanding. And then I kind of diverged away from plastic for a while and came back into it and was like, oh, much more research has come out, and it's not just dinoflagellates that it's affecting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is most people's experience. My children have heard about microplastics all the way through, but in
Yeah.
my generation, it was plastics. As soon as someone said plastics to you, you imagined a plastic bottle, a fully formed
Right.
product, and we were certainly aware that there was a problem that these fully formed bottles were appearing in places that seemed impossible because waste was going everywhere. It wasn't quite the waste problem that we have now, but we're certainly already seeing it. But there wasn't that thinking that they could break down, and regulators were thinking the same. So when they were sort of went through that process at the end of the last century of going, hey, we need to have a process for identifying problematic chemicals because we've seen all of these harms that have happened from things. There were some of the nasty chemicals or like PCBs and lead in the past. We need to have a process to assess chemicals for safety. There was a question, well, which ones are we going to assess? Do we need to look at these polymers? Do we need to look at the plastics? And there was they made the same assumption that the rest of us were making. Well, these things don't break down. A bottle's not going to you're not going to swallow a whole bottle. It's not going to enter your bloodstream. It's not going to get into a plaque in your carotid artery. It's not going to cause problems with your health. And there was this exclusion. If a molecule was bigger than a certain size, which meant that it wasn't going to get absorbed, it didn't need to be assessed for safety. It was just assumed safe. And there was a missing bit that the molecule, it doesn't stay that size. It breaks down into something smaller, but that wasn't appreciated back then.
That just seems so wild. I mean, because at that point we had known, lead is in the water, lead is breaking off of pipes, lead is, being absorbed by the body. I think it's the body confuses it for calcium. Correct me if I'm wrong in some cases. And it's just wild that we didn't think that that could be a potential issue with this new material, this new-ish material, and we just kind of ignored it. I guess it just comes down to, industry being industry and whatnot, but that it's just wild that we went this long and without realizing it.
Yeah, so we've got ourselves into the same problem as we had with lead. I think lead's a great example. By the time we're looking for the harm, we're at a point where everyone's already exposed.
Right.
And we've just kind of accepted that we're going to just run an experiment on us, except no one's collecting the data. No one's actually making that evaluation of whether it's safe or not. And that is exactly what happened with lead. Lead was known to be poisonous in high concentrations for centuries. Centuries. You have too much lead, and it causes significant damage to your brain. And that was a sort of obvious thing that could be linked to where your food had been stored or how your water had been transported to you. And it was such a big dose and such an obvious health effect that link could be made before modern science, that this stuff is bad if you've got a high enough concentration. And that's where I bring it straight back to microplastics and bring it back to the chemicals we haven't investigated. These microplastics, not only weren't we really cognizant that they were there, the research wasn't being done for whether they're harmful.
Mm-hmm.
Actually only now catching up with the techniques to even be able to assess it. So there's really no, where there's gaps in evidence and uncertainty, I don't feel that there's any stronger reason to assume things are safe. And this idea that you assume that it's safe until you absolutely demonstrate without any doubt harm is a strange and very risky approach from my perspective. We're only being able to detect microplastics and nanoplastics at the size where we're no longer talking about trying to swallow a drinking bottle and it getting into your bloodstream, but it's a small enough level that we think that it could get through the gut wall, that it could pass through our loop round and round in our circulation, because our blood vessels get really, really small as they come out to the capillary networks and back out to the veins again, and then from the blood system get through the walls and into the tissues. And we're only just pushing our ability now to be looking at microplastics in the size that we should expect that to happen. So up until now, we've been flying completely blind, and we're still flying blind. But we should now be aware that there is this uncertainty and that we can start managing that risk, and saying we should expect that microplastics get down to a nanoscale that's small enough to be getting into our tissues, and that the limitation is the technique to find it. We're going up personally. We're going to find it. What size, I don't know. What concentration, I don't know. But we're going to find it. It's the technique needs to catch up to find it.
So with the harm to the cells and us not knowing at what levels is safe and kind of going off what you said about lead and everything, what are kind of some of the illnesses associated with these plastics and its chemicals that we're starting to see? And through your studies, are you starting to notice an uptick of over the past couple of years, especially with the further research?
We got great. As soon as you ask that question, we've got to switch to talking about the chemicals again, the ones that we actually detect in human bodies, and then that means that we can do the studies like they did with lead. There's a small number of chemicals. I'll maybe just keep it really simple and talk about 3 chemicals: bisphenol A, the group of chemicals that we call phthalates, and the group of flame retardants called PBDEs, which are a group of brominated flame retardants. And it's linked to two of the other big risk factors for heart disease in adults. Like heart disease in adults, and I should say cardiovascular disease, because the same things that underlie heart disease underlie stroke. The big 3 of obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure, hypertension, all 3 of them are linked with your BPA exposure.
Wow.
And this is something that we've seen increasing levels, increasing health problems over time, and have been asking ourselves, what is the environmental cause that's explaining this happening? And there's been a lot of blaming on lifestyle, that later research is suggesting that we have less control over our weight than we would have assumed 20 years ago, and that terms like obesity can be problematic, where someone's body is essentially being endocrine programmed to put on more weight.
That's fascinating. And I'm going to ask a question. It might sound kind of weird and outlandish, and like, is there a chance, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, is there a chance that like with the increase in human population that this is just a natural thing? Like, I know this is kind of a devil's advocate question, but like an increase in genetic variants, could that lead to some of these issues? Or what is that deeper connection with the BPAs that we're seeing? Because I mean, you talked about how we just kind of figured out to start testing for them. Is there a connection with the amount of genetic variants that we're starting to see with an increased population?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad to hear you ask it. I think sometimes people sort of assume A causes B, therefore A must cause all B.
Right.
I I have been involved in research in a number of what we call non-communicable diseases. They're the
Hmm.
non-infectious diseases. So that's things like cardiovascular health, but in kids, especially neurodevelopment, things like the neurodiversity and neurodevelopmental disorders, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, where we're seeing increasing prevalence. And two questions always come up. Is it just because we're looking for it better, and is it because of genetics? In things like heart disease, it's not because we're better looking at it, because it's not something you miss.
Right.
Yes, the prevalence is definitely going up. In neurodevelopmental disorders, look, it's great. We are looking better for these things, and that's changing things for the better. Kids are getting early intervention. They're getting to draw on the strengths that come along with the difficulties of neurodiversity. But the data is pretty consistent that that can't explain all of the increase. So is it genetics? Genetics is too slow. The genetic drift that we see from generation to generation cannot explain what we're seeing. So there is an environmental factor. Is all of it BPA? No, it's not.
Right.
Is all of it changes in our chemical environment? Like it could be. We should be worried that it might be, because BPA is just one of multiple bisphenols that and all of those other bisphenols have take similar effects on cells when you test them in a lab.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Symeonides, for coming on and speaking about plastics and all the health effects, and then not finishing off with all doom and gloom. So, really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on, Aidan. I've really enjoyed our conversation in my morning and your night.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad that these conversations are happening across the globe, and that people are coming together and having these conversations.
Yeah, I really appreciate you again, and I hope to see you maybe at INC4 or INC5.
Yeah, see you there. I'm going to be there. I'm looking forward in sharing that message, that health message, with the delegates during INC4.
Perfect.